So it's time to show you what we can create with the Sony FX30 and the very basic Sony kit lens. And I want to show you guys this scene that is actually shot by the FX30 and a kit lens. Very basic lighting, but you need to understand the basic fundamentals of how to light this scene, how to expose the scene, and how to deal with a lens that doesn't have a fast aperture. And look, there isn't a right or wrong when it comes to lighting these kind of scenes, but using the house lights probably isn't the best way. We are trying to light to evoke a certain type of emotion. And when it comes to this particular scene, this is the kind of emotion that I'm trying to evoke when it comes to, late at night, working on the car. So it really just depends on your storytelling. And I also want to talk about how to expose for the lights that you can't control. So this work light doesn't have a specific setting where you can actually dial the intensity. It's just one intensity, and that's what you need to expose for, and then create your lighting scenes around this particular light. Now, one of the biggest things that we're going to be running into with the FX30 and a kit lens is, obviously the kit lens is a 3.5 to 5.6. We're currently at about 22 mils, which is giving us an f4. So we're going to run into some noise issues. Specifically, it's a Super 35 sensor. It's a slower lens. So you will notice in the shadows that there's a little bit of noise there. But this is where we need to try and bump up the exposure as high as we can without clipping, then bring the levels down in post. What we don't want to do is underexpose the scene, which is going to allow us, or going to make us, bring the exposure up, which is going to bring the noise floor up. That's what we don't want. Now, one of the first things that I do when I assess the scene is which direction am I going to film at. Generally, you shoot into the L's of the room, which obviously makes the scene look longer, larger, have more depth. But this wasn't really suited to the location. So I shot pretty much to the flat wall, so it was side on where the car was. And what's going to allow me to create depth is my lighting and obviously shaping the light to the scene. So this is pretty much the scene with just the work light and the house lights. You can see it's not bad. It does the job. The house light is kind of, I guess, backlit. So I'm still getting kind of like a negative shape here. But it's still not as good. So if we do turn off the house lights, which I will, it's obviously going to be really dark. That might be underexposed, but you can see here I'm properly exposed right now. So we need to expose for the lights that we can't control. For this particular scene, it's this work light. It's not dimmable. It only has one setting. It's at 2700 Kelvin, but I've checked my exposure when it comes to my waveforms. It looks pretty good right now. If anything, I could probably bring the levels up just a touch more to give me a little bit more sort of boost. But you can kind of see the difference between the FX30 and the kit lens and the A7 IV and the G Master. So that's an f1.4 ISO 800. That's an f4 ISO 800, but it's a full frame versus APS-C or Super 35. So you'll notice that, yeah, the A7 IV will probably look better and cleaner in the shadows. So you can sort of see the key light is pretty much clipped on here, but majority of the levels are actually quite at a decent level. So we're at about 50%, and my skin tones are roughly about sort of 50 or 60%, which is perfectly fine. You just don't want majority of your scene to be too close to the blacks, the zero. You want to try and lift as much shadows as possible through exposure and not just bumping up your ISO. This second base ISO is 2500. You can see the difference between ISO 2500 and ISO 800. It bumps up the shadows. There's nothing on zero, which is cool. Which you perfectly can expose the scene with this ISO, the second base, but you don't want to rely on that if you can. Now this one's all about contrast ratios. So when I'm in contrast ratios, what kind of exposure is on this side in comparison to what is on this side? You can see this is very dark and this is very bright. Essentially, we're looking at like maybe an 8:1 contrast ratio. So this is, far darker than this scene. If I wanted it to be a 2:1 ratio, essentially the exposure, well, let's say this is 50% on the skin tones, it'd be 25% on this side of the skin tone. So it's 50% less, which is a 2:1 ratio, but it's far more than 2:1 with this one. More contrasty, but it gives the sense of a work light and more of a natural vibe here. So one of the lights that we actually require to have when it comes to this kind of scene is to create depth, and we need something in the background. Otherwise, if we didn't have this light in the background, it would just be completely dark. Sure, we would have the main scene right here, which is perfectly fine, but then from there onwards, completely dark, and that's not what we want. So if we do actually have this light here, this is the 300C with a projector on it, and you can see the gobo coming down onto the wall. So it's creating a little bit of shape and obviously giving us that depth. Now I do have the light on like a cool blue, so it's at 200 with the hue, and the saturation's at about 20%. Now I could actually use the CCT and just have it at 6500 Kelvin, but it's a little bit too white. Now this key light is at 2700 Kelvin, which is obviously nice and warm. That's gonna create that warmth in the skin, but I need that sort of separation between that warmth and provide a cooler background. And that's where, you know, having that HSI and trying to, you know, put more of a cooler background with that sort of blue tone to it is definitely gonna give us much more shape and much more depth. These colors are also called complementary colors. Now this adds color contrast to the scene, which creates far more depth than you normally would if you had the exact same color. The effect wouldn't be as strong if they were the exact same color. You can see now they're both at 2700 Kelvin. This doesn't necessarily mean you can't have the same colors as a key light and a backlight. The effects just isn't as strong as having complementary colors. The color contrast creates the separation as you're seeing in this image. And one of the things that's going to give us a little bit more atmosphere is obviously fog. Now, if we do have a haze machine or a fog machine in here, it's going to give you a little bit more halation when it comes to this key light. But also one of the key factors of haze is that when a light hits the haze, it kind of brings up the exposure. So you're actually exposing the atmosphere, which brings up the levels, which is great because the FX30 and the kit lens, you know, we're going to run into sort of low light issues because it's not fast. It's a noisy sensor. So having haze is actually going to help with the exposure on the FX30. Now, it's good to provide haze, but you don't want it to be too hectic. So definitely spread it out so it fills up the room as much as possible. Otherwise it's going to look, you know, completely unnatural as well. But hey, this is a car scene. It could look like the car, you know, is kind of broken. There's some smoke pouring out of the engine, but you know, I still want to make it a little bit more natural. And if we do sort of put this one on, you can see here creates a little bit of halation, and obviously the background, it sort of lights it up a little bit more as well. Which is, you know, absolutely fantastic. Now also because we are at an f3.5 to 5.6, mise-en-scène is going to be pretty important, or essentially what is in the scene. So you're going to have a larger depth of field, you're going to be able to see more in the background. So you kind of have to tidy up the screen or whatever is in the scene and make sure that whatever's in the scene is meant to be in the scene or adds to the story. Now, the thing in the background when it comes to the projector, this is where you're going to see the sharp lines. So you can actually dial that back and not have the lines to be obviously as sharp as they actually are, which I can actually do. Loosen this up and I'll just make it a little bit. So that probably looks a little bit more natural. I've sort of changed it up so it's a little bit more blurry and you're not going to see harsher lines, and it probably just looks a little bit more natural. But these are the things that you do have to take into consideration if you don't have a really fast lens and a very shallow depth of field. Now this is the 24 G Master lens on the FX30, so it is a little bit tighter than what I had before, but this is an f1.4, whereas before I was at the f4 when it came to about that sort of 22mm sort of focal length. This is just going to be faster. It's going to have cleaner shadows, but I may actually be overexposed now, so I have to take it into consideration of my exposure because my lighting has stayed exactly the same. So looking at this, we're looking at about 75% at skin tones, probably a little bit too much. but I can't control this light. So that means I either have to obviously drop that aperture down or put an ND filter on the front, which is obviously going to, you know, cut back on the light. But we'll see how this looks in post-production. Now that actually shows you that you can get away with using a kit lens, a very basic kit lens, and your APS-C camera and still make the image look fairly decent. Now, nothing is really definitive when it comes to the style and look. Obviously, having a key light is quite advantageous in a lot of situations, but you could still have a silhouetted character and have it completely backlit. There are so many different ways you can actually help tell the story, but it really does depend on individual style, personal preference, and obviously what is going to help you move that story through. But this is just a very basic video to show you what you can actually achieve with the basic kit lens, and I hope it's going to give you some motivation to actually get out there and start, you know, applying some of these basic fundamentals to your filmmaking. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next one. All right, let's get it.